Crimea is in bad shape. Putin is losing his grip over the peninsula. But what about Russia's armored trains? Could they save Crimea for Russia? You might have heard the news recently. Crimea is not in a good place for Putin. It's now just a matter of time until Ukraine retakes control of their stolen territory. But Russia has a potential answer to its Crimea supply crisis. It involves steel plating, machine guns, anti-aircraft cannons, and rail lines that have existed since the Soviet era. It's called an armored train. Choo-choo! And the fact that this is even worth discussing as a serious option tells you more about Russia's logistical situation in Crimea than any map you'll find online, because an armored train can protect itself against the threats of 1943. It can't protect itself against an FPV drone dropping from 50 meters above a rail bridge in 2026. It can't reroute around a destroyed switching station. It can't operate outside the fixed geography of a rail network Ukraine has been systematically targeting for 4 years. Russia's armored trains are real. They've deployed in occupied Ukraine, and they're not useless in every context. They just can't save Crimea. And that's a problem for Russia. Hey friends, I'm Wes O'Donnell, defense journalist, Army and Air Force veteran, where we live in fame or go down in flame because nothing will stop the US Air Force. It's weird that those are the only two options. You get famous or you die. Anyways, today we're covering two things that belong together: Russia's armored trains and Russia's rapidly deteriorating ability to keep Crimea supply. Connecting those two topics tells us something important about how Russia thinks about logistics security in the 21st century and why that thinking keeps getting punished by a Ukrainian drone operator sitting in a field with a laptop and a Starlink dish. Here's the question worth asking before we get into the hardware. Russia's Crimea supply situation in 2026 is genuinely dire. The Kerch Bridge is under persistent threat. The last ferry across the strait was disabled in April. The M14 highway, Russia's final overland route, is being turned into a kill zone by Ukrainian drones, now reaching 200 kilometers behind the front. So what does Russia do? Well, in the 20th century, the answer to supply line vulnerability was protection through armor. Put enough steel on something and it survives. Now that thinking produced the armored train, a logistics and fire support platform straight out of a James Bond movie that proved effective in the Russian Civil War, devastating in World War II, and genuinely relevant through some of the Cold War. But Russia still has these, still deploys them. The question of whether they can solve Crimea's supply problem is worth taking seriously because the answer reveals exactly why Russia's position is more dangerous than a static map suggests. Russia's armored trains aren't museum pieces, they're operational platforms, updated from the Soviet-era designs and deployed in occupied Ukrainian territory since the early phases of the war. I even made a video about these armored trains getting attacked by Ukraine on several occasions. A typical configuration involves modified rail cars with steel plating, Zu-23-2 anti-aircraft cannons, heavy machine guns, sometimes mortars or artillery, and troop compartments for infantry. They're mobile fire support platforms that can move personnel and supplies along rail corridors while projecting force against threats along that route. In the right threat environment, they make tactical sense. Against an adversary armed primarily with small arms, RPGs, and light weapons, a steel-plated train with anti-aircraft guns and a company of infantry is a meaningful deterrent. Russia used similar platforms to protect supply routes in Afghanistan. They patrol rail lines through mountainous terrain against mujahideen armed with small arms and shoulder-fired weapons, and it worked with some effectiveness against that specific threat. But the threat environment in Ukraine in 2026 is not Afghanistan in the 1980s. So when we look at why armored trains can't fix this problem, we need to understand how bad the problem actually is. Russia has always maintained 3 ways to keep Crimea alive. The first was the Kerch Bridge, the road and rail link Russia built after illegally seizing Crimea in 2014. Ukraine has struck it repeatedly. A major explosion in October of 2022 collapsed sections of the roadway. Naval drones hit it again in 2023. In June of 2025, Ukraine's security service used 1,000 kilograms of underwater explosives against the bridge supports, temporarily suspending operations. Traffic resumed, but Russian commanders are now extremely reluctant to move military equipment across it. As recently as May 16th, the bridge suspended operations for 11 hours for security reasons, delaying a dozen trains. That kind of disruption is now routine. The second was the ferry network across the Kerch Strait. Ukraine took those out one by one. In early April 2026, the last ferry, the Slavyanin, was disabled. Ukraine's military intelligence agency released imagery of the vessel in flames. The same night, Ukrainian forces struck the Russian port of Kavkaz in Krasnodar Krai. The maritime backup is gone. And the third is the M14 highway, the overland corridor running through Mariupol and Melitopol into Crimea. Until May of 2026, it was largely beyond Ukraine's strike reach. Then Ukrainian drones proved they could reach 200 kilometers behind the front, and the highway started burning. Russian mill blogger Maxim Kalashnikov compared it to the roads in Soviet-era Afghanistan. Kherson Governor Saldo signed a decree restricting freight traffic on May 21st. That's just last week. The Institute for the Study of War confirmed the strikes were working. By May 23rd, Sevastopol was rationing fuel at 20 liters per vehicle. Russia is down to one corridor, and that corridor is actively under attack. So, armored trains. The Kerch Bridge has a rail line. In theory, an armored train traversing it provides protected movement of supplies directly from Russia into Crimea. But before I get accused of giving Russia any good ideas, there are several problems with that theory, and they compound each other. The bridge itself is the vulnerability, not the vehicles crossing it. Ukraine isn't trying to shoot the trains, it's targeting the structure through underwater explosives, aerial strikes, and approach infrastructure attacks. None of that is addressed by armor on the rail cars. You can plate every car on the train, and it doesn't matter if the bridge section beneath it gets hit while it's crossing. A train on a bridge is also the least maneuverable object in any threat environment. It can't accelerate meaningfully, it can't stop quickly, it absolutely cannot leave the track. If Ukraine detects a military train on the Kerch Bridge and Ukraine maintains ISR coverage over that strait, the train is a fixed object on a fixed structure at a known speed with no options. Also, the armor on an armored train protects against threats arriving from the sides. The FPV drone arrives from above. That gap is the entire problem. The M14 highway and the rail corridor through occupied southern Ukraine are geographically inseparable. The rail network follows the same choke points: Mariupol, Melitopol. There's no rail route into Crimea that bypasses the geography Ukraine is already targeting, because there's no other geography to route through. So, an armored train on the M14 rail corridor faces the same fundamental problem as a truck convoy on the M14 highway. It's moving through fixed, mappable, watchable geography, with one additional vulnerability a convoy doesn't have. A truck convoy has options. It can reroute, it can disperse, it can accelerate through a threat window, it can turn around. A train on rails, well, it goes where the tracks go, through the junctions and the bridges that already exist, and at the speed the infrastructure allows. Destroy one rail bridge on the corridor and everything behind it stops. Destroy a switching station and you can strand a train without ever touching it. Target the locomotive and the armored cars behind it go nowhere. Ukraine doesn't need to penetrate the armor. It needs to remove one piece of infrastructure from a fixed network. That is not a difficult targeting problem in 2026 for Ukraine. Now here's the doctrine point that gets lost in the hardware discussion. Military protection evolves in response to the dominant threat. Armor was developed because the primary threat was direct fire. Bullets and shells and shrapnel traveling horizontally from enemy positions. You put steel between your soldiers and the threat, and the steel works. The drone shifts the threat axis from horizontal to vertical. The threat arrives from above, at low altitude, at a cost of a few $100s, with guidance precision that didn't exist in the platforms this armor was designed to defeat. Steel on the sides of a rail car doesn't address a threat dropping from overhead. This is the same fundamental problem Russian armor has faced throughout this entire war. The T-72 was designed for a threat environment where Tanks engaged other tanks from the front. The drone arrives from the top. The armored train doctrine comes from exactly that same generation of thinking, and it carries the same vulnerability at larger scale on a fixed route. Now, I'm not saying this to be clever about Russian military history. I'm just saying this because understanding the threat axis mismatch explains why Russia's instinct to protect supply lines through armor keeps failing in this war. Now, let me be fair about what armored trains can actually do, because they're not useless in every scenario. Against sabotage teams, partisan operations, and light infantry threats, they provide genuine security for rail infrastructure. In lower intensity occupation environments against adversaries without significant drone capability or strike reach, they have real tactical value. Russia almost certainly used them effectively in occupied territories earlier in the war, when Ukrainian strike reach was more limited. The specific problem is Crimea's supply situation right now, where the threat isn't partisans with rifles, it's Ukrainian FPV operators with Starlink reaching 200 kilometers behind the front, targeting whatever moves predictably on a fixed route. Russia almost certainly knows this. The point isn't that Moscow is seriously planning to run armored trains across the Kerch Bridge as its Crimea logistics solution. The point is that when you work through Russia's actual remaining options, compromised bridge, disabled ferries, burning highway, the armored train represents the category of thinking Russia is forced into. Industrial age protection applied to a post-industrial threat. That's the category mismatch, and it's the real problem for Russia. So, here's what the armored train question actually reveals about the Crimea situation. Russia's problem isn't that it lacks armored platforms. Russia's problem is predictability. Ukraine doesn't need to destroy everything. Moving into Crimea, it only needs to make Russian logistics predictable. Predictable routes get watched. Watched routes get hit. Hit routes get avoided. When routes get avoided, commanders start rationing. When commanders start rationing, soldiers feel it. And when soldiers feel it, the defense weakens, opening up Crimea to Ukraine taking it back. An armored train on a fixed rail line is the most predictable logistics platform that exists. It announces its route by virtue of having only one route. It announces its speed by virtue of being a train. It announces its timing by virtue of needing to pass through specific junctions and bridges at known locations. There is no version of a train that operates off the rails, and Ukraine has been studying those rails for 4 years. Heck, even longer, going back to 2014. The armored train doesn't make the corridor safe. It makes the corridor's problems more heavily armored while leaving the corridor's fundamental vulnerability untouched. And that vulnerability is already being exploited, one burning fuel truck at a time. Russia isn't out of options. It can adapt convoy timing, disperse vehicles, invest in electronic warfare over the M14 corridor, move at night, and absorb losses at a scale that would be politically unsustainable for most governments. Russia's threshold for acceptable waste remains, as this war has demonstrated, genuinely horrifying. The supply situation is dire, but it isn't yet fatal. Whether Ukraine can sustain this level of pressure long enough for dire to become untenable depends on continued drone production, continued Western support, and sustained Ukrainian military initiative. None of that is automatic, but Russia's options keep shrinking, and options that keep shrinking eventually run out. Russia built a bridge to prove Crimea was permanent, stationed a fleet to defend it, established a land corridor as a backup, and a ferry network as a backup to the backup. Ukraine put the fleet in port, pressured the bridge, disabled the ferries, and started burning the highway. Now the serious conversation about Crimea's logistics future involves platforms designed to defeat threats from 1943. That's not an argument that Russia is helpless. Russia is resourceful sometimes and willing to absorb costs that rational governments would never accept. But it is an argument that Ukraine has forced Russia into a shrinking set of options, and the options that remain are increasingly mismatched to the threat doing the forcing. The armored train can't save Crimea, not because the platform is worthless in every context, but because the threat making Crimea vulnerable doesn't arrive from the side of the track. It arrives from above, and it already knows where the tracks go. That's it for today, my friends. If this was useful, please hit subscribe. I cover Ukraine, NATO, and modern military technology 4 times a week. and the algorithm needs the signal. For deeper analysis, I'm on Substack, where subscribers get the longer pieces and early access to what I'm working on before it becomes a video. And as always, glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Crimea is Ukraine.